You don't belong in the VIP lounge. Rachel Whitman didn't lower her voice when she said it, and that was the point, because at 7:18 p.m. on a quiet Friday evening inside the glass-lined Skybridge Lounge overlooking downtown Chicago, her words cut through the soft jazz and low conversation like a sudden crack in polished marble, and every head within 20 feet turned toward the tall black man standing calmly at the entrance as if the room itself had paused to watch what would happen next, and Darius Cole didn't flinch, not when Rachel crossed her arms, not when she glanced at his dark jeans and simple charcoal hoodie, not even when she slid the velvet rope slightly closer to block his path as if the gesture alone could define who belonged and who didn't, because Darius had seen that look before, the quick judgment, the silent calculation, the decision made before a single word was exchanged, and he simply nodded once, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, like a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere else he needed to be, while behind him the elevator chimed softly and a couple in tailored suits stepped out, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and Rachel's tone shifted instantly as she smiled at them, stepping aside with practiced warmth. "Welcome to the VIP lounge," she said brightly, gesturing them forward without asking for names or reservations, and the couple passed Darius without a glance, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air as they moved inside, and Darius watched the rope swing back into place, the motion slow and deliberate, before he finally spoke, his voice low and even. "I'm here for the 7:30 reservation," he said, and Rachel tilted her head slightly, her smile gone. "VIP reservations are for members only," she replied, her tone clipped now, her eyes already drifting past him as if the conversation were finished, and a man seated near the window lowered his glass of sparkling water, his curiosity obvious, while a young bartender paused mid-pour, sensing the shift in the room, and Darius reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone without urgency, his movements measured, unbothered, as if time belonged to him, and Rachel let out a small breath that sounded almost like a quiet laugh. "Sir, I don't think you understand," she said, tapping the clipboard in her hand. "This lounge is exclusive," and the word exclusive lingered in the air like a test, like a challenge, like a line drawn across polished stone, and Darius glanced past her at the skyline glowing beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights stretching for miles. Then back at Rachel, his expression unchanged, calm and steady, while somewhere behind the bar a glass clinked softly and the music continued, low and smooth, and the tension settled in the room like a quiet storm gathering just beneath the surface, because Darius didn't step back, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, he simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, as if waiting for something only he knew was coming, and Rachel shifted her weight slightly, her confidence firm, unaware that the next few minutes would change everything inside the VIP lounge. The silence stretched for another few seconds and the room began to breathe again, but the attention never fully left him as Darius Cole remained where he stood just outside the velvet rope, his calm presence drawing quiet glances from nearly every corner of the lounge, while Rachel Whitman checked her tablet with exaggerated patience as if the screen would confirm what she had already decided about him. And the skyline beyond the glass walls shimmered with evening traffic headlights moving like slow rivers of light nearly 20 floors below, while a server passed carrying a tray of sparkling water and paused just slightly as he noticed the tension hovering near the entrance, and then continued on as if unsure whether to intervene or simply watch like everyone else. And Darius shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort but with the quiet ease of someone who had spent years in rooms far more tense than this one, and he glanced briefly toward the host stand where a small brass sign read "Members and invited guests only," the lettering polished and precise like the room itself. And Rachel finally spoke again, her tone polite but firm. "I can check the general seating area for you if you would like," she said, already turning slightly as though preparing to end the conversation, and Darius responded with the same measured calm. "I am here for the Skybridge investors' reception," he said, and the words lingered in the air because the reception had been mentioned only quietly among those invited. And Rachel paused for half a second before her expression returned to neutral and she tapped her tablet again, her eyebrows tightening just enough to show irritation rather than curiosity. "I do not see your name here," she replied, and a man seated near the window leaned forward slightly, his interest now impossible to hide, while the bartender slowed his movements again, listening without appearing obvious. And Darius nodded once more, not arguing, not insisting, just observing, and that quiet patience began to unsettle the certainty Rachel had been holding. And she glanced toward the elevator again as another pair of guests arrived dressed in tailored suits and leather shoes, and once again she stepped aside, immediately offering a welcoming smile, while Darius remained where he stood, the rope still marking the invisible boundary between assumption and access, and the two guests entered without question, their conversation fading into the low music and soft lighting while Darius looked around the lounge, taking in the details, the soft amber lights reflected across polished wood tables, the skyline stretching miles beyond the glass, the quiet hum of conversation that now felt slightly different because several people were watching and waiting, and Rachel cleared her throat as if reminding herself of control. "Sir, I am going to need you to step aside," she said, her voice still composed but edged with impatience, and Darius looked at her calmly and then stepped half a pace to the side, not leaving, not retreating, just moving enough to show cooperation without surrender, and that small movement seemed to confuse Rachel more than resistance would have, and she folded her arms again, her posture tightening as the seconds ticked forward. And then from across the lounge a young woman in a navy blazer paused near the bar, her eyes drifting toward Darius as if something about him felt familiar, though she could not yet explain why. And the elevator chimed again, and the quiet tension held steady, like a moment suspended before something shifted, and Darius remained calm, hands relaxed, eyes steady, as though he already knew the room was about to change. The elevator chimed again, and this time the doors opened to reveal three guests dressed in tailored suits, their voices low but confident as they stepped onto the marble floor, and Rachel Whitman immediately straightened her posture, offering her practiced smile while guiding them past the velvet rope without hesitation. And as they entered, one of them glanced briefly at Darius Cole, then at Rachel, as if silently asking a question, but Rachel answered it with a subtle shake of her head, and the group moved on toward the center of the lounge, where soft lighting reflected against polished wood tables and quiet conversation resumed around them. Yet the tension near the entrance did not fade, because more eyes had begun to follow the exchange, and the young woman in the navy blazer near the bar tilted her head slightly, watching Darius with growing curiosity, while a man seated near the window checked his watch, then looked back toward the entrance as if waiting to see what would unfold next. And Rachel tapped her tablet again, more firmly this time, scrolling with quick precise motions as if determined to confirm her earlier judgment, and after a moment she exhaled quietly, then lifted her chin. "Sir, I still do not see your name," she said, her voice measured but firmer now, and Darius nodded calmly, his expression unchanged. "I understand," he replied, and the simplicity of his response seemed to unsettle her, because he did not argue, he did not plead, he simply remained there, composed as if he had every reason to stay. And Rachel glanced toward the hallway leading to the private offices, then back to him, and the second stretched long enough for the bartender to slow again mid-pour, and the server returning with empty glasses to pause near the edge of the room. And then Rachel reached beneath the host stand, picking up a small radio and pressing the button with quiet confidence. "Mark, can you come to the entrance?" she said, her tone calm but deliberate, and within moments a tall man in a dark suit stepped out from the hallway, his name tag reading Mark Jensen, and he walked toward the host stand with measured steps, his expression neutral as he assessed the situation. And Rachel gestured subtly toward Darius. "This gentleman is not on the list," she explained, and Mark nodded once, then turned to Darius, his voice polite but distant. "Sir, do you have confirmation of your reservation?" And Darius reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone and glancing briefly at the screen before lowering it without showing anything just yet, and Mark watched him carefully while Rachel folded her arms, her confidence returning as if the presence of support reinforced her position. And across the lounge the young woman in the navy blazer shifted slightly, stepping closer to the bar, her attention fixed on the entrance, and a quiet murmur began to ripple through the nearby tables, not loud enough to interrupt the music but noticeable enough to signal that the room had become invested. And Darius looked at Mark calmly, then at Rachel, and finally at the skyline beyond the glass before speaking. "I am here for the investors' reception," he repeated, and Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at Rachel before replying, "I understand, sir, but access is limited." And Rachel nodded quickly as if confirming the statement, and the tension settled deeper like a slow gathering storm, because Darius still did not move, still did not leave, and the young woman near the bar took another step forward, her expression sharpening as recognition slowly formed, while the elevator chimed once more and the quiet anticipation in the room grew stronger with every passing second. The elevator chimed again, and the doors opened slowly, revealing another pair of guests stepping onto the marble floor, but this time the attention near the entrance did not shift away from Darius Cole, because the young woman in the navy blazer had already taken another step forward, her expression sharpening as recognition settled in, and she placed her glass gently on the bar before walking toward the host stand with measured confidence, while Rachel Whitman and Mark Jensen remained focused on Darius and The tension lingered in the air like quiet static, and the woman stopped a few feet away, her eyes moving from Darius to Rachel then back again as if confirming what she already suspected, and finally she spoke, her voice calm but clear. "I think he is on the list," and the words cut through the low music just enough for nearby tables to notice, and Rachel turned slightly, her expression tightening. "I already checked," she replied quickly, her tone controlled, but edged with irritation, and the woman nodded once but did not step back. "My name is Ava Brooks," she said. "I handled part of the investor confirmations this afternoon, and I remember seeing his name." And Mark glanced at Rachel, then at Ava, his posture shifting subtly as uncertainty entered the space, and Rachel tapped her tablet again, more firmly this time, scrolling faster as if determined to reaffirm her position, while Darius remained still, his calm presence unchanged. "And Ava continued, her voice steady, "I reviewed the final list around 5:30 and there was a late addition," she said, and Rachel shook her head without looking up. "Late additions are routed through management," she replied, and Ava folded her hands lightly in front of her, maintaining composure. "I understand, but I still remember the name." And the room grew quieter as nearby guests leaned slightly closer, their conversations fading into low murmurs, and the bartender paused again, watching the exchange unfold, and Mark cleared his throat, glancing at Ava. "Do you recall the name?" he asked, and Ava looked at Darius briefly, then back to Mark. "Yes," she said quietly, "Darius Cole." And the moment the name settled in the air, Rachel stopped scrolling for a fraction of a second before resuming her movements, and she shook her head. "I do not see it," she said firmly, and Ava stepped closer to the host stand, her eyes narrowing slightly. "May I see the list?" she asked, and Rachel hesitated, then tilted the tablet slightly, but not enough for Ava to read clearly, and the subtle gesture did not go unnoticed by those watching, and Darius remained calm, his hands relaxed, his gaze steady, as though the unfolding tension confirmed something he had already expected. And Ava looked at Rachel again, her tone respectful but resolute. "I am fairly certain he was added under executive access," she said, and Mark shifted his stance, glancing between them while the skyline lights shimmered behind the glass, and the quiet anticipation in the room deepened because the balance had begun to shift. And Rachel straightened her shoulders, her confidence returning. "I will verify with management," she said, pressing the radio again, and as she lifted it the elevator chimed once more, and every second felt heavier as the lounge waited for the moment that would change everything. Rachel Whitman lifted the radio toward her mouth, but before she could speak another group of guests approached the entrance, their voices low and confident, and Rachel lowered the device, instantly shifting back into her welcoming posture as she guided them inside without hesitation, and the contrast did not go unnoticed by those watching. While Ava Brooks remained beside the host stand, her expression calm but resolute, and Mark Jensen glanced again at Darius Cole, then toward Rachel as uncertainty lingered in his posture, and the group entered the lounge, their conversation fading into the soft hum of music, while Rachel turned back with renewed firmness. "Sir, I am going to need you to step away from the entrance while we verify," she said, her tone still polite but now edged with authority, and Darius nodded slightly, taking a small step to the side again, not retreating, just adjusting his position enough to allow others to pass, and that quiet compliance seemed to frustrate Rachel more than resistance would have, and she shifted her weight, then added, "It should not take long," while Ava watched carefully, her eyes moving between them, and the skyline lights flickered beyond the glass, reflecting across the polished floor as the room settled into a quiet anticipation. And Darius remained composed, his hands relaxed, his gaze steady, as if the unfolding tension confirmed something familiar, and in that stillness a memory surfaced, uninvited, the kind that arrived quietly without warning. He remembered a conference reception in New York 12 years earlier when he had stood outside another private room dressed in a simple blazer while a staff member asked him to wait until invited guests arrived, and he had watched as others walked past without question, and he remembered the same polite tone, the same assumptions wrapped in professionalism, and the same quiet patience he carried then as he carried now. And the memory faded as quickly as it appeared, and he returned his focus to the present, while Rachel glanced toward the hallway again, pressing the radio this time softly. "Management, I need confirmation at the VIP entrance," she said, and the response crackled faintly through the speaker, a brief acknowledgement that left the situation suspended for another moment, and Mark folded his hands loosely in front of him, maintaining a neutral stance though his eyes remained attentive, and Ava leaned slightly closer to the host stand. "I am certain he was added under executive clearance," she repeated, and Rachel gave a brief nod without looking up, still scrolling through her tablet as if searching for reassurance. And nearby a man at the window set down his glass quietly, his attention fixed on the exchange, while the bartender slowed again, the low music continuing like a steady pulse beneath the tension. And then Rachel stepped forward slightly, her posture firm. "Sir, if you would please wait near the seating area," she said, gesturing toward a small lounge space just outside the rope, and Darius glanced at the space then back at her before taking a calm step toward it, settling into the nearby chair with composed ease. And The subtle movement shifted the room. Because he did not leave, he did not withdraw, he simply sat as if time belonged to him, and Ava watched him with quiet recognition while Mark exhaled slowly and Rachel lowered her tablet for a moment, her confidence holding, yet the anticipation in the room deepened as the elevator chimed again, and every second felt closer to a turning point. Darius Cole sat calmly in the low leather chair just outside the velvet rope, his posture relaxed yet deliberate as the skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls and the soft amber lights reflected across the polished floor, while Rachel Whitman remained behind the host stand tapping her tablet with quiet impatience, and Mark Jensen stood nearby, his neutral expression slowly shifting into cautious curiosity, while Ava Brooks stayed a few feet away, her attention fixed on Darius as if the pieces were beginning to fall into place. And the elevator chimed again, the sound echoing softly through the lounge as another pair of guests stepped out, and Rachel immediately shifted into her welcoming tone, guiding them past the rope without hesitation, and once again the contrast hung in the air like an unspoken question, while Darius watched the exchange quietly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements slow and unhurried as though every second belonged to him, and he glanced at the screen for a moment before making a brief call, lifting the phone to his ear and speaking in a calm low voice that barely carried beyond the chair. "I have arrived," he said simply, and there was a short pause before he added, "Yes, I am at the entrance," and then he ended the call without explanation, placing the phone back in his pocket and returning to stillness while Ava noticed the gesture, her expression sharpening slightly, and Mark glanced at Rachel, who continued scrolling through her tablet as if determined to maintain control of the situation, and the bartender slowed again, the quiet music filling the space, while a man seated near the window leaned forward slightly, sensing that something had shifted, and Rachel finally looked up, her voice measured. "Sir, we are still verifying," she said, and Darius nodded once. "I understand," he replied, his tone steady and calm. And the simplicity of his response seemed to unsettle her confidence again, and Ava stepped closer to Mark, her voice low but clear. "Executive confirmations usually come directly from ownership," she said, and Mark glanced at her, then back at Darius as uncertainty deepened and the skyline lights flickered across the glass, reflecting like distant signals, while Rachel pressed the radio once more. "Management, I need confirmation at the VIP entrance," she repeated, and the faint response crackled again, still leaving the answer suspended, and the seconds stretched longer, and then the hallway door opened quietly and a staff member stepped out, glancing toward Rachel before walking briskly toward the elevators, and Rachel watched him go, her posture tightening slightly, while Darius remained seated calm and composed as though he had already seen this moment unfold before, and Ava folded her hands lightly, her gaze steady, and Mark shifted his stance again, his neutrality fading into anticipation, and the elevator chimed once more and the doors opened slowly, and the quiet tension in the lounge deepened as every second edged closer to a turning point. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and the man who stepped out did not rush, yet the shift in the room was immediate, because Charles Whitman carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need announcement, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his navy suit tailored with understated precision, and his pace calm and deliberate as he walked across the marble floor toward the entrance, while conversations inside the lounge softened almost instinctively, and Rachel Whitman straightened behind the host stand, her expression shifting into professional composure as she prepared to greet him. "Good evening, Mr. Whitman," she said with a practiced smile, and Mark Jensen stepped slightly aside while Ava Brooks watched carefully, her eyes moving from Charles to Darius Cole, who remained seated calm and unbothered as if he had been expecting this exact moment, and Charles nodded briefly to Rachel, his attention already moving past her toward the seating area, and his gaze settled on Darius, and for a fraction of a second the air changed because Charles slowed, then smiled slightly, a subtle recognition that did not go unnoticed by those nearby, and he walked directly past the velvet rope, ignoring the clipboard, ignoring the host stand, and stopping in front of Darius, while Rachel hesitated, her confidence faltering as she watched the interaction unfold, and Charles extended his hand with calm respect. "Darius, glad you made it," he said, his voice warm but measured, and Darius stood smoothly, returning the handshake with quiet familiarity. "Traffic was lighter than expected," he replied, and the simplicity of the exchange settled across the room like a ripple, because the tone between them was not formal, it was familiar, and Ava exhaled quietly as recognition fully formed, while Mark glanced at Rachel, whose expression tightened slightly as she struggled to understand the shift, and Charles turned slightly toward the host stand, his voice calm. "Rachel, we were expecting him," he said, and the words landed with quiet clarity, and Rachel blinked once, glancing at her tablet, then back at Charles. "The first did not see his name," she replied, her tone careful, and Charles nodded gently. "He was added under executive access," he said, and Ava gave a small confirming nod while the bartender slowed Again, and nearby guests leaned subtly closer, sensing the turning point, and Rachel lowered her tablet, her posture stiffening as realization began to settle, and Charles gestured lightly toward the lounge. "Please join us, Darius, we have been waiting," he said, and Darius nodded once, stepping past the velvet rope without hesitation, his calm presence now moving through the space that moments earlier had been denied to him. And as he walked beside Charles, the tension dissolved into quiet understanding. While Rachel remained behind the host stand, her certainty replaced by silence, and the skyline lights shimmered beyond the glass as the room shifted completely in a single measured moment. The shift in the room was immediate as Darius Cole stepped beside Charles Whitman and walked deeper into the lounge, the quiet conversation softening again as guests subtly watched them pass, and the skyline lights reflected across the glass behind them, while Rachel Whitman remained frozen behind the host's stand, her tablet lowered slightly in her hands as the certainty she held only moments earlier faded into uneasy silence. And Mark Jensen glanced toward her, then back toward Charles and Darius as if realizing the weight of what had just happened, and Ava Brooks exhaled quietly, her posture relaxing as confirmation replaced uncertainty, while Charles gestured toward a reserved seating area near the windows where a polished wood table overlooked the city lights, and Darius took his seat with calm ease, his presence now welcomed rather than questioned. And Charles turned slightly back toward the entrance, his expression composed. "Rachel, could you join us for a moment?" he said, his tone calm but deliberate, and Rachel hesitated for a brief second before stepping away from the host's stand, her posture careful as she approached the table, and the nearby guests sensed the shift, leaning subtly closer without appearing obvious, while the soft music continued beneath the tension. And Charles rested his hands lightly on the back of the chair, his voice steady. "Rachel, this evening is important," he said, and she nodded once, her voice measured. "Of course, Mr. Whitman." And Charles continued, "Darius is not only attending the investors' reception, he is leading tonight discussion," and the words settled across the space like a quiet revelation. And Rachel blinked, her composure faltering slightly as she glanced toward Darius, who remained calm, his expression unchanged. And Charles continued with quiet clarity, "He is also the majority partner for this location," he said, and the air seemed to still for a fraction of a second while Ava lowered her gaze slightly and Mark shifted his stance near the entrance, and Rachel lowered her eyes briefly, her confidence replaced by realization. And Darius spoke calmly, his tone steady. "I prefer to arrive without announcement," he said simply, and Charles nodded understandingly and then turned back toward Rachel. "We expect every guest to be treated with respect," he added, and Rachel nodded again, her voice quiet. "Yes, sir," and the nearby guests resumed their conversation slowly, the tension dissolving into quiet understanding while the bartender resumed pouring drinks and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass, and Darius leaned back slightly, his calm presence steady as the room returned to its rhythm. Yet the shift remained undeniable, because in a single measured moment the balance of the entire lounge had changed, and Rachel stepped back toward the host's stand, her posture subdued, while Ava exchanged a brief glance with Mark, and the elevator chimed once more. But now the atmosphere felt different, calmer yet heavier with the quiet weight of what had just unfolded. The lounge settled into a quieter rhythm as the conversation resumed around the polished tables, and soft amber lights reflected across the glass walls, while Darius Cole remained seated near the skyline, his posture relaxed yet composed. And Charles Whitman spoke briefly with a few arriving investors before excusing himself and stepping away, leaving Darius alone for a moment, and the stillness felt different now, not tense but reflective, as several guests glanced toward him with new understanding, while across the room Rachel Whitman returned to the host's stand, her movements slower, more deliberate as she adjusted the tablet in her hands, and Mark Jensen leaned slightly toward her, speaking quietly, while Ava Brooks resumed her place near the bar, her expression calm yet thoughtful. And the elevator chimed again, but this time the sound blended naturally into the atmosphere as the evening moved forward, and after a moment Darius stood and walked calmly toward the entrance, his steps measured as he approached the host stand, and Rachel looked up immediately, her posture straightening, her expression careful and composed. And Darius stopped a few feet away, his voice calm and steady. "The view is impressive tonight," he said, glancing briefly toward the skyline, and Rachel nodded quietly. "Yes, it is, sir," and the simplicity of the exchange softened the space between them, and Darius continued, his tone even. "I appreciate how seriously you take your role," he said, and Rachel hesitated, slightly surprised by the calmness in his voice. "Thank you, sir," she replied, and Darius nodded once, then added, "Every guest deserves the same welcome, especially when you do not know their story," and the words settled gently between them, not sharp, not accusing, just Clear, and Rachel lowered her gaze briefly, understanding the meaning behind them. "Yes sir," she said quietly, and Darius gave a small nod before turning back toward the lounge, his calm presence steady as he returned to the table near the windows, and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass while the music continued softly, and Ava watched him for a moment, then exchanged a quiet glance with Mark, and the evening flowed forward as conversations deepened and glasses clinked softly, and the earlier tension faded into reflection. And as the investors gathered around the table, Darius spoke calmly about partnership growth and community investment, his voice measured and confident, and the guests listened with respect. The earlier assumptions replaced by recognition, and the lounge felt different, not because the lights had changed or the music had shifted, but because the understanding in the room had grown. And as the night moved forward, the city lights stretched for miles below, and the quiet lesson lingered in the air like the final note of a song. Because Darius had never raised his voice, he had never demanded attention, he had simply remained steady, and in that calm presence the entire room had shifted, and the skyline beyond the glass reflected a city built on ambition and perseverance, while inside the lounge respect had been quietly redefined.